From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In The NoCo. I'm Brad Turner, in for Erin O'Toole. There's an unusual firefighting operation underway near Boulder. Crews are working to extinguish a blaze that has burned underground for more than a century. It's happening on Marshall Mesa, in an open area that's popular for hiking. A fire in a coal seam there has been smoldering beneath the surface for years. It's a remnant of a time when coal mining thrived in the area. Heat from underground blazes can sometimes set fire to grass and other brush nearby. So in the weeks ahead, crews at Marshall Mesa will prepare to dig up the combustible material and bring it to the surface. They'll mix it with cooler dirt to prevent future fires.
The actual work itself is relatively simple.
That's Jeff Graves. He's director of Colorado's Inactive Mine Reclamation program, and he's overseeing the job. Jeff talked with me about how crews will snuff out the blaze and says Marshall Mesa is one of at least 38 sites in Colorado where coal is burning underground.
There's a lot of different methods that the coal can ignite. One of the biggest is probably spontaneous combustion, and that just occurs over time as that coal gets exposed to oxygen. It heats up and then can result in combustion of the coal. We also have some anecdotal stories of historically miners tipping over a candle or something else that might ignite the coal. And then there's also the risk of wildfires igniting any kind of coal at the surface.
Wow. So what are the telltale signs that there's a coal seam fire burning underground, and do they flare up at some times more than others?
Typically, the visual evidence associated with a coal mine fire is the smoke plume that may rise up from some kind of event or fracture in the ground surface. One thing we actually use quite often to identify areas of heat at the surface is following snowfall. And so we'll go out to sites and be able to identify the extent of surface heating based on where that snow is melted.
How hot do these underground fires burn?
We've documented temperatures in excess of 1,000 degrees. Those are on our most active fires, but they're very dynamic. And so sometimes these fires will go through periods of inactivity where there's not much happening. And then depending on something changing underground that allows additional oxygen to come into that fire, sometimes we'll see temperatures rise relatively quickly and can be in excess of 1,000 degrees.
How serious a threat is the Marshall Mesa coal seam fire when it comes to setting the nearby grass and vegetation ablaze?
We certainly have evidence historically. I think it was late 2005. The fire there did ignite some vegetation at the surface and then required the fire department to respond. Recently, we have not identified any significant activity at the site other than just continued smoldering of that coal under the surface. We did a large drilling program about a year or so ago to identify the extents of that fire, and we were able to identify temperatures of about 240 degrees in a couple of locations. So it's certainly smoldering. We wouldn't call this a highly active fire, but there's always that risk and potential, which is one of the reasons why we're focusing on this site right now.
There's a fairly infamous coal seam fire near Glenwood Springs in western Colorado. It caused at least one major wildfire that destroyed homes. Do some of these blazes burn more intensely or have more of a tendency to ignite compared to others?
For sure. I think the geology of the site impacts how intensely that coal burns. Over in the Glenwood Springs area, the coal is very steeply dipping. So typically coal is deposited flat lying, but over there, because of the events of geologic history, that coal's been uplifted and it creates almost a chimney type effect once the coal has been mined out. You've got all these pathways that allow for oxygen to move uphill, and it pretty much acts exactly like a chimney. So you get very intense fires through that area based on the geology underground. Marshall Mesa is relatively flat-lying coal there.
The underground blaze on Marshall Mesa was examined as a possible cause for the Marshall Fire, which burned about 1,000 homes in Louisville and Superior in 2021. I know investigators have pointed to a burning slash pile and downed power lines as more likely sources. and not this coal seam. But how did the Marshall Fire affect the urgency around putting out this underground blaze?
I think from our standpoint, it raised the urgency because there was concern within the community. And so we felt like it was responsible for us to work towards extinguishing that fire, to address that.
Your crews are doing a lot of digging, and you've got thousands of gallons of water on hand. How are you going to put this fire out?
Really, it just involves excavating all the way down to where we've identified that coal. So that's about 30 feet below the surface. I think the coal seam is about 6 to 8 feet in thickness. So we'll dig down to that 30 feet, which requires us to remove all that overburden material also. So we dig all of that up, spread it out at the surface, begin to allow that hotter coal to cool, and then mix in all that other material on top of the coal that we dug out in that process. So that helps to not only cool the coal, but then also reduce the potential for future ignition, because now we've diluted the amount of total coal that goes back into the ground. So we dig it up, we mix it, we cool it with a little bit of water, and then we put it back into the excavation once we're completed.
And help me get a visual of how you're doing that mixing. Are you using shovels? Are you using heavy equipment? What's doing the work?
So we're digging up about 180,000 cubic yards, which is quite a bit. And so that process will be to utilize bulldozers to spread that material at the surface. They'll track back and forth across that, helping to mix in material, allowing it to cool. So it's going to be a pretty large scale operation to not only excavate it, but then to mix it, allow it to cool, and then put it back into the hillside. So no shovels in this operation.
Jeff, you oversee the Inactive Mine Reclamation Program for this state, and you don't get to choose where these fires are that you have to try and put out. I wonder if you have a story about one that was particularly challenging or unusual to extinguish.
Oh, gosh. I'll say each one has its own set of challenges, but where the topography is very difficult, steep slopes makes it really challenging not only to mitigate a fire, but to even access it. So a lot of these will be climbing 1,000 foot up a hill, having to put in roads on slopes in excess of 45 degrees to be able to mobilize the equipment to actually do the mitigation. And so I think when you start talking about challenging sites, as that topography gets more steep, the roads become much more difficult to get in place. Marshall, we have the advantage of having excellent access to the site.
This one's right off the highway, piece of cake.
Certainly from an access standpoint.
Jeff Graves is director of the Inactive Mine Reclamation Program for the state of Colorado. He's overseeing the work at Marshall Mesa. By the way, Jeff mentioned an interesting safety precaution at the site. The area can see really strong wind gusts, and that's something that fueled the Marshall Fire. So Jeff says workers will make sure any hot material from underground is covered up on windy days. Find links to more coverage of the work at Marshall Mesa in our show notes or at KUNC.org. That's it today for In The NoCo. I'm Brad Turner. Thanks for listening.